If you take the government's own forecast, we're going to have another 6.5 million people coming into the country in 12 years. That's basically 10% population growth in little over a decade. So it took us 50 years to go from 55 million people to 65 million people. It's going to take us 20 years to go from 65 million to 75 million. The pace of change that we're going to see in this country over the next decade, people haven't really even begun to understand how much change we're going to see. 92% of all of our population growth here in the UK will be down to immigration. So we are going to become very quickly a much more ethnically, religiously, culturally, demographically diverse society, where I think it's going to become obvious to everybody pretty quickly that because a lot of that migration is from outside of Europe, it's going to become incredibly hard for us to simultaneously maintain the cultural bonds, the values, the traditions, the ways of life that make us who we are, that define our society. So it isn't just about GDP. It isn't just about housing. To go back to the 60s and something Bobby Kennedy said is it's also about all the things that GDP doesn't measure. It's about, our ability to get on with our neighbors, our sense of belonging, our belief in the better side of our country and the better side of who we are. A lot of that stuff is going to be challenged over the next 10 years in ways that I don't think we can really currently comprehend.
It's really scary. I'm not somebody who is that au fait with the microcosm of daily government things. So can you explain in a sort of lay level, who is the person in government now going, well, we need more of this, and why?
Well, I would say what we have is a political class overall, both within the mainstream political parties and the bureaucracy of government departments, that lean much further to the cultural left than the average voter. And that includes the Conservative Party, by the way. This idea that what we're living through in much of Europe is a kind of resurgence of the Third Reich and hard right politics is something that liberals like to talk about. But it's clearly not actually borne out in terms of policy. If you were to take somebody like Boris Johnson and the British Tories, well, they've liberalised the immigration system to a degree that not even New Labour and Tony Blair would have done. They've presided over an explosion of immigration. And that has partly been pushed on by people in the Treasury, economic-minded civil servants who view mass migration as basically a sticking plaster for many of the problems that we don't really want to fix. So they're looking at how we can keep people working in the social care system, how we can keep people working in the National Health Service, how we can keep international students going into the universities. The more difficult longer-term solutions to those problems is to think about, well, how do you pay more people, pay people more money in the social care system? How do you get more British kids to go into the National Health Service? Do we need as many universities as we currently have? Is the higher education system really working? But instead of dealing with all of that, what we have is a political class that is basically saying, well, let's just use mass migration as a way of putting off these choices, and let's have an era of what I would argue is managed decline. And I think across the West, what we're living in is an era of managed decline. And it's not a conspiracy, it's just a combination of incompetence, ideological motivations on the left of politics, and I think a lot of conservative centre-right politicians who are unwilling to challenge the dominant consensus and the status quo. And those who do, like Donald Trump or Marine Le Pen or Nigel Farage or the Brexiteers or whoever, are roundly criticised for doing so and are basically, attacked nonstop. So we have a kind of embedded political class that I think is fully invested in this policy of mass migration.
Do we need some amount of? Sorry, this just seems mad. This just seems really mad, and it's maddening. And we're seeing the country just fall apart before our eyes right now.
It's insane what we're living through. I'll just give you one stat, just so viewers don't, because they might not know this. We've had 2 million people come into the UK over the last 2 or 3 years. 2 million people. What percentage of those do you think came in on a high-skilled working visa, that came in to take high-skill, good jobs that are driving growth in the
No,
economy?
it must be relatively low.
15%.
15.
15%. So you say, who are the rest? Well, the rest are relatives of those workers, students, relatives of students, asylum seekers, illegal migrants. A lot of people coming in to do jobs that are below the median wage, are low skill, non-selective. And so what I'm saying, just to be absolutely clear, the British people have been lied to by Boris Johnson, Dominic Cummings, and pretty much every frontline mainstream politician of the last 20 years, because the British people have been consistently told they would get lower migration and high-skill migration. What they got was mass migration, uncontrolled migration, low-skill migration, low-wage migration, which is surely steadily undermining the country and essentially diluting who we are. And nobody's being real with people about this. The US is going through a very similar process, the collapse of control on the southern border, the rapid increase in illegal and legal migration. Canada has now finally accepted that this policy has been a disaster. Sweden, people on the left and the right now accept mass migration has been a complete catastrophe, leading to open gang violence and bombings in downtown Stockholm. The Germans are now coming to the same conclusion, as are the Italians. The only people who aren't are the sort of radical, for lack of a better word, woke left people who tend to dominate the institutions and the architecture of politics. But the average person out there on the street can sense what's happening. They can sense it's a disaster. They know it's suppressing their wages. They know it's undermining the economy. And more importantly, they know it's putting themselves and their families at risk, because what we now have is a very real and present security risk, which we can see in the aftermath of October 7th. More clearly than ever before, we've allowed too many people into Western societies who hate who we are, who don't share our values, and who are not fully invested in upholding the rule of law, our traditions, culture, and ways of life.
Does Australia have a different system then, when they're a little bit more picky about who they let in?
The Australians have had a points-based system, and that was the original inspiration for what Boris Johnson tried to do in the UK. But what quickly became apparent is that basically the government had no real interest in implementing a high-skill policy. So they essentially lowered all the salary thresholds. They've now been trying to raise them to deal with the mess they've created, and they've simultaneously lost control of the borders, because while the UK left the European Union through Brexit, we didn't actually leave many of the things that would have allowed us to genuinely take control of our borders, like the European Convention on Human Rights. We didn't reform the Human Rights Act. We didn't reform things like the Equalities Act as well. So many things that were left over by Tony Blair and the Labour governments, Boris Johnson and the Conservatives could have completely rewired this country. They could have completely set a different foundation. But for the Americans looking in at the UK, if you really want to understand why this fiasco and this failure has continued, I have to say Boris Johnson is a major reason why, because he was never really a conservative. He was a bohemian liberal who basically liberalized the whole system.